Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for October 21st, 2021. This is Chris Driscoll, your co-host, and along with me is your other co-host, Rainer Shea. Tell me, Rainer, what have you been up to?
I've been writing some of the later parts of my novel, Comrade Desmore. It's about a man, Tom Desmore, who decides to become a traitor to the communist movement in the United States by taking the easy way out in life and opportunistically using his journalistic writing talents for spreading imperialist propaganda. Kind of a worst case scenario in terms of moral failings, like movement betrayals. I bet you can think of some people within the communist movement or within social movements in general who have sold out, who've been co-opted.
Yeah. Or at least I suspect. I suspect whole entire parties of doing that. But I don't know. There may be some more complex kinds of reasons for that. I don't know, but yeah. Well, it sounds like a very interesting novel.
Yes.
So how far along are you?
I'm working on the second draft right now. I'm on chapter 11, which in terms of the books, like compared to the book's ultimate length, is I only have a chapter and a half left to go.
Oh. Well, is this a short novel, long novel?
It's
medium size?
It's 11, it's going to be 12 chapters. plus a prologue, which with each of these 13 sections taking up a few thousand words.
Each section taking a few thousand words. Few as in two or more than two? Or
At least
how many
at least a
words? How many words? Approximately how many words do you think the novel will be?
I don't know. I have to add it up.
It's a simple thing.
I have to estimate
word count.
something like probably between 30 and 40,000.
So that's a very short novel.
Yeah, and that's good because
Yeah.
people's attention spans are limited. I don't want to.
Well, from what I understand, short novels, all else being equal, short novels do very well. So that's good. Anyway, let's move on to the show, to the meat of the show. First off, we're going to be dealing with the major resurgence in strikes in America. October has already achieved its own nickname, October 2021. Striketober. Strike, yes, I'm serious. Striketober is the nickname for October 2021. And here are some of the reasons. On October 5th, 1,400 workers at 4 Kellogg's cereal plants went on strike to block the company's concessionary demands. They are members of the bakery, confectionery, tobacco workers, and grain millers, which recently struck Frito-Lay and Nabisco. That adds up to strikes at 3 Fortune 500 companies involving thousands of workers by a union with 65,000 members. Healthcare workers are also on the move. More than 24 California hospitals have experienced strikes, and 24,000 members of the United Nurses Association of California, Union of Healthcare Professionals, have overwhelmingly approved a statewide strike against Kaiser Permanente. Nurses in Worcester, Massachusetts, on strike at St. Vincent's Hospital have been out since March 8th. In Buffalo, New York, 2,000 healthcare workers followed suit at Mercy Hospital on October 1. Alabama coal miners have been on strike since April 1st against Warrior Met, and indirectly against the major Wall Street stockholder BlackRock, the world's largest investment firm. Metal workers struck 2 factories in Cabell County, West Virginia. Over 400 are still out at Special Metals. Another 10,000 workers began a strike October 14th against John Deere, hitting 14 plants in Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, Colorado, and Georgia. This strike is the first in 35 years against the agricultural and construction equipment company. Over 90% of the United Auto Workers members at Deere rejected the first contract presented to them. The difficulty finding workers may also have been a factor in a recent negotiation between the film and television industry and the International Association of Theater and Stage Employees. Some 60,000 IATSE members were set to begin a countrywide strike on October 18th, lifting the total number of current strikers to over 100,000. Many actions of unorganized workers, often atomized or with only a handful of coworkers, are still of an individual character. Millions of workers have been leaving their jobs a record 4.3 million in August. The lowest paying jobs are seeing the highest numbers of quits. As Workers' World Party First Secretary Larry Holmes explains, from a genuine Marxist perspective, as the changes in productive forces bring more workers across the planet into contact with each other, class-wide solidarity becomes not only more practically possible, it also becomes more necessary. Indeed, without greater political and strategic solidarity, the capitalist ruling class will use technology and globalization to isolate and atomize the working class. So that gives you a kind of a feel for why this month is being called Striketober. What do you think?
Yeah, that part about them hoping to bypass the consequences of class inequality by using technology, that's something for us to worry about. But obviously, it does not negate the power of class struggle. Even if they can fully replace the workers or replace the vast majority of the workers with robots, that's going to come at the cost of depriving all of these people of the ability to become proletarians. Already, we've had this massive unemployment explosion in these last couple of years that's driven tens of millions of people in the US alone into permanent unemployment. And at some point, there's going to be blowback from that disaffected, disenfranchised mass. Right now, the blowback from the lower classes, from the poor, is mainly visible within the poor people who are still allowed to be proletarians. But at some other point, those people on the margins of the economy are also going to have the opportunity to take charge, to organize, to struggle for the establishment of a workers' democracy that can get them jobs. I think that we need to focus not just on getting the workers themselves involved in communist organizing, but getting the unemployed into communist organizing. We're in a situation where capitalism is throwing off so many people as automation accelerates, as the Great Reset carries through this huge leaning into the high-tech sector within U.S. capitalism. And at some point, there's going to be consequences for the way that capital has been behaving.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, topic number 2. The first of over 200 bodies being exhumed from Lugansk, Ukraine mass grave, one of Obama's atrocities. This comes to us from the Greanville Post, October 19th, 2021. And it's we'll have a link to the article, because I'm just going to give you some highlights of the article, and it goes into a lot more than what I'm going to go into here. One of Obama's atrocities, 200 bodies being exhumed in Lugansk, Ukraine mass grave. Russell Bentley says he recently witnessed the exhumation of human remains from a mass grave that contains 200 bodies in Lugansk, Ukraine. It was profound and profoundly disturbing experience. Each body in this grave represents an unnecessary and unjust death, a murder, and each of these 200 murders can never be forgotten or forgiven. This was one of many atrocities of the Obama-Biden regime. When Obama orchestrated the coup d'etat against the democratically elected Yanukovych government in Kiev in early 2014, they used the grisly assortment of secret agents, ultra-violent neo-Nazis, the oligarch traitors who deposed Yanukovych, and installed a Quisling gang of collaborators whose primary traits were bootlicking fealty to their U.S. masters, swinish avarice, and a willingness to terrorize and murder their own civilians while ruthlessly suppressing even the slightest resistance or even peaceful dissent. And all of these same vile traits are shared by the U.S. Gauleiter, the self-described point man, who from the very beginning was the man in charge of Obama's Project Ukraine, the man giving the orders and calling the shots of the U.S. occupation, and of course, taking the big dog share of the looted billions, none other than Joe Biden. Though today Biden's is simply a senile puppet, back in the days of his vice presidency, he was a ruthless gangster and a very dangerous man. He ruled Ukraine with an iron fist like a true warlord or mafia chieftain. His word was law, and his law was obeyed by the groveling parasites and bloodthirsty sycophants he put into power. His orders to crush the legitimate uprising in the Donbass, including by war crimes and mass murder, like the 200 mass grave of 200 being exhumed right now, gave his Ukrop henchmen no pause, and they scurried to fulfill their master's orders, just as Bandera collaborators had done for their German Nazi masters 70 years before. Vice President Biden personally made 6 trips to Ukraine, half of them in 2014. This was during the heaviest attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces and neo-Nazi battalions against the people of Donbass, and Biden's visits preceded by only a few days or weeks the worst crimes of the war. There can be no doubt these crimes were done not only with Biden's permission, but on his orders. These crimes include the murder of over 100 protesters and armed Berkut police by snipers at the Maidan in Kiev, the mass murder by burning to death scores of peaceful protesters in Odessa on May 2nd. That was May 2nd, 2014. The airstrike on Lugansk on June 2nd, and false flag attack that murdered 298 innocent civilians on flight MH17 on July 17th. From Nuland and Payat, handpicking the new unelected Ukrainian government, to every illegal political, economic, and military decision, Ukrainian lapdogs jumped every time their US master said jump. The orders were clear: suppress the uprising in the Donbass by any means, legal or illegal, and the more brutal and ruthless, the better. And the attacks were brutal and ruthless. And now Biden is back again. Although Biden's recent mental deterioration has clearly made him unqualified to drive a bus, much less be president of the USA, his hubris and hypocrisy, and his absolutely immoral obeisance to his masters continue to make him a truly evil and dangerous man, not just for Donbass or Ukraine, but for the whole world. And naturally, that includes the citizens of the USA as well.
This is going to need to be memorialized in a parallel way to how atrocities like the Indonesia purge have been memorialized. That is to say, that decades from now, there at least needs to be a widespread sense of awareness that atrocities were committed in Ukraine. Because when you look up Ukraine in the U.S. media, you find no mentions of this. Well, maybe aside from some articles in the Nation, which is better than most U.S. media outlets. At least there are articles in the Nation, the liberal publication, about how Biden has been complicit in the Nazi Ukrainian regime's glorification of Holocaust participants. Aside from that, there's really no mainstream discussion about these atrocities that have been taking place throughout these last 7 years in Ukraine. And most troublingly, there has been this narrative that the idea of Ukraine being Nazi run is pure Russian propaganda. So I think it's extremely important for journalists, independent journalists like me, to take up the task of ingraining this into the consciousness as best we can.
I think so too. Well put. Okay, next on the list. Why, imperialists apply Africa destabilization model to Latin America.
Since Obama's pivot to Asia, wherein the new Cold War, the new asymmetrical hybrid war on China kicked off, and also since George W. Bush created AFRICOM in 2007, Washington has been destabilizing Africa, perhaps more than ever. The Horn of Africa in particular has undergone great political instability due to U.S. meddling, due to U.S. interventions like the 2011 bombing of Libya into a failed state, due to U.S. sanctions on countries like Ethiopia, due to the U.S. Backing terrorist proxies such as the TPLF, which has been deliberately exacerbating the famine within Ethiopia. And Washington is doing this to try to geopolitically counter China, to score some great power competition points against China. And now they're expanding this destabilization Cold War era model into Latin America. I believe this is in reaction to the fact that the imperialists continue to fail in their coup attempts in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and Bolivia, and to the fact that revolution is increasingly brewing in Latin American countries like Colombia and Haiti. It's no surprise that Colombia and Haiti have recently experienced great instability due to U.S. influence. In Haiti, the imperialists have used their Colombian mercenary proxies to assassinate a president this year, exacerbating the instability there. In Colombia, the imperialists are backing their narco-criminal armies. And in Bolivia recently, they activated their armed right-wing forces to seize control over a coca market in the city of La Paz and displace the local coca growers. They're trying to use this market economic and social influence to gain leverage and try to attack the socialist Bolivian government from there. They're likely going to fail in that, but they have seized control over this this local sovereign within that part of Bolivia, and they have taken control over a market. So that's a defeat for the anti-imperialist movement to note. That happened just a couple weeks ago. Hopefully, we're going to see that reversed. The imperialists want to keep sowing more instability. They want to keep taking advantage of the chaos they're creating through their sanctions by inflaming proxy wars like the Colombia-Venezuela border war. They want to turn Latin America into one big Ethiopia.
Yeah. The AFRICOM was begun under Obama, if memory serves.
I thought it was a year earlier.
Perhaps, but I think it really got underway under the Obama regime. It's a unpleasant and treacherous side of U.S. imperialism that they're not giving up without a fight, especially now in Latin America, where things are really heating up and have really been heating up for the last year and a half or 2 years. So we'll have to see what we can see, but this is something that we would expect, that both in Africa and in Latin America, the declining empire, the declining evil empire, is attempting to shore up what it's lost and to recover areas that it had lost in the past. So just what we could expect, but we have to step up our understanding of all these areas, arenas, operations in Latin America and in Africa. In the long run, we will win, but how and when will depend a lot on how successful we are around the world, how successful the Marxist-Leninists are at organizing and agitating for a real effective counter revolution. And I'd say that's basically what these Americans are up to. These imperialist Americans are up to is a counter revolution. So this would be a counter revolution. Next on the list, why does the West hate North Korea? This also comes from the Greanville Post from October 18th, 2021, and we'll have the link under this video. I'm just finding it here. Why does the West hate North Korea? More than 60 years ago, millions of people above the 38th parallel died. They were literally slaughtered by the US-led coalition. After that, after its victory, North Korea was never left in peace. The West has been provoking it, threatening it, imposing brutal sanctions, and of course, manipulating global public opinion. Why? There are several reasons. The simple one is because it is a communist and because it wants to follow its own course, as Cuba has been doing for decades, as several Latin American countries were doing lately. But there is one more, much more complex answer, because the DPRK fought for its principles at home, and it fought against Western imperialism abroad. It helped to liberate colonized and oppressed nations, like Cuba, it did it selflessly as a true internationalist state. The African continent benefited the most, including Namibia and Angola, when they were suffering from horrific apartheid regimes imposed on them by South Africa. It goes without saying that these regimes were fully sponsored by the West, as was the racist madness coming from Pretoria. Let us also not forget that fascist apartheid South Africa was one of the countries that was fighting on the side of the West during the Korean War. The West never forgot, never forgave the DPRK's internationalist help of many African nations. The DPRK refused to surrender its independence and its path. It continued developing its defensive nuclear program. The West's propaganda apparatus remained in top gear, spreading toxic fabrications and polluted the entire planet with them. As a result, the entire world is convinced that North Korea is evil, but it has absolutely no idea why. The entire charade is built on cliches, but almost no one challenges it. The Korean War, by the way, the U.S. and UN war on the people of Korea from 1950 to 1953, literally 1 out of every 3 people in North Korea was killed. Practically all of the buildings in all of the cities were destroyed. Literally, this is the closest that the imperialists in America or anyone else ever in the history of humankind has ever come to actually wiping a nation off the face of the earth. And they did it presumably without any nuclear weapons. They did use chemical weapons galore and biological weapons galore, but no nuclear weapons, at least not that we know of. So the people of the DPRK went through hell on earth for those 3 years. And yet they built their country up into a glorious model of modern socialism in the meantime, in the about 60 years since that time. So you really have to hand it to them, hand it to the people of Korea, how tremendously brilliant, energetic, gallant they have been in rebuilding their country after it was utterly devastated by the imperialist United States and its chief allies.
I think that the DPRK has recently been getting the rewards, like some unprecedented rewards from its choice to defy U.S. imperialism. its choice to defy U.S. imperialism has come at such a steep cost. But lately, during the pandemic times, the DPRK has become one of the few countries on Earth that's, from what I understand, had 0 COVID deaths. I mean, South Korea is a relatively successful example of a capitalist country beating back against COVID-19, but compared to the DPRK's pandemic success story, South Korea's success story is tiny. It's pretty incredible what they've been able to do with their socialist economic model that makes quarantines and hygiene and medical care so efficient, along with their unique position of being able to isolate. Something to note is that none of the other existing socialist countries have been able to totally avoid pandemic deaths or cases, but it's something to note that between North Korea and South Korea, it's the socialist half of Korea that's been able to bypass all of these complications, all of this nastiness from the pandemic. North Korea hasn't even had to implement a COVID vaccination policy because it's not had to respond to any pandemic outbreaks. That's how good it's been.
Yeah, really. Okay, next. What will anti-colonial socialist revolution look like?
In this article, I compare the conditions of pre-revolutionary Russia with the conditions of the current United States, what's currently called the United States, and I basically echo what you said last week about how, as was the case with the Soviets deciding to grant self-determination to all of the nations that were occupied by the Russian Empire by giving them the ability to vote on whether they want to stay, whether they want to join the new socialist workers' state or break away. That's going to need to be the case within what's currently called the United States and within the entire North American continent more broadly eventually. All of these occupied indigenous First Nations, the African nation, the Chicano nation too, let's not forget them, are going to need to be able to decide their own fate. And I was arguing last week, and I argue in my article too, that instrumental to this will be the giving of all the occupied land back to the indigenous First Nations. I mean, I feel like that's simply the logical aspect to it. How can they decide their own fates without having full control over or the land that was stolen from them? And by full control, I mean full jurisdiction, parallel to the full jurisdiction that the several indigenous tribes in the eastern half of Oklahoma recently acquired.
Yeah. This is quite an interesting topic. I've been doing a lot of research actually into the Soviet. It's pretty complex, the Soviet, as you could well imagine, because we're dealing with hundreds of nations, hundreds of nationalities. We're dealing with numerous counter-revolutionary white guard operations throughout. We're dealing with a revolution and then a civil war. And at the end of that process in 1922, after the Civil War was essentially over and the Trotsky's Red Army, as it was called in those days, decisively beat back all of these challenges. And it was a monumental challenge. After all of that, it was only then that the Russian Socialist Federation began the process of negotiating with the main nations other than Russian in what would become the Soviet Union to work out the original organization of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it took a lot of complex give and take to get to the point where most of these nations decided to go into, on an equal basis, to go into the creation of a union of Soviet Socialist republics. It wasn't an easy task at all. It's very complex. I've all week long, practically, I've been reading articles and books from numerous books that touch on the subject. And part of the problem is that there's not a single book out there that I can find that actually deals just with this topic, with the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922. And the negotiations that led up to the founding of the Soviet Union. So it's really a time-consuming task to do the research necessary, because I'm having to look at just parts, bits and pieces of numerous books and numerous articles to get at the truth in this. I really wish somebody had actually written a book on the subject, a single book that would be a definitive look at this. And, you know, maybe I should do that. Who knows?
Maybe
anyway,
I should do that today.
Or maybe you should do it. It's really a fascinating topic. Next on the list, let me see, where are we at? Behind the Uyghur Tribunal, U.S. government-backed separatist theater to escalate conflict with China. And this comes from the GrayZone, October 17th, 2021. We'll have the link for you. Let's see if I can find it here now. There we go. Behind the Uyghur Tribunal. The resulting terrorism not only targeted aspects of Chinese state, but also fellow Uyghurs who refused to adopt this imported extremist ideology. While the Western media makes little to no mention of this extreme violence now, and it looks like I've dropped something here, but basically what we started out with here was a description of a few years back, about 10 years back, of the terrorist assaults all over China by a tiny minority of Uyghur Uyghur terrorists, Anyway, while the Western media made little or no mention of this extreme violence, in order to depict security operations in Xinjiang as senselessly repressive, media organizations like the BBC were more than happy to report on the murder and mayhem as it unfolded, to highlight Beijing's apparent helplessness against it at that time. As the US government's propaganda campaign against China drags on, a mock tribunal has become a central node for the dissemination of allegations of Uyghur genocide to US media. But behind the carefully scripted horror stories conveyed to the public by an uncritical media are massive discrepancies, overt separatist sentiments, and huge sums of US government money. This June, Uyghur separatists and Washington-funded operatives of the human rights industry organization organized a Uyghur Tribunal to build the case over 80 tedious hours of testimony that the Chinese government is guilty of the crime of genocide in its western Xinjiang province. While the mock tribunal presented itself as independent, it was organized by a US government-funded separatist group that has for years played a key role in generating anti-China propaganda. To help buttress the narrative spun out of spectacle, major media organizations such as CNN have generated various slideshows featuring star witnesses from the tribunal. In the process, they have inadvertently exposed major inconsistencies in the witness testimonies, exposing the entire exercise as another Western information weapon deployed against a target nation. The US government claims that China is carrying out genocide against ethnic Uyghurs, many of whom are Muslim, in an effort to erase them culturally. This has provided the narrative basis for high-profile media spectacles like the Uyghur Tribunal. No motivation or context is provided to explain why China's government would be carrying out such putative abuses. In reality, a campaign of terrorism in pursuit of separatism was unfolding in China's Xinjiang region from the early 1990s onwards. A violent extremist minority of Uyghurs had been radicalized by Wahhabi fundamentalism imported from Saudi Arabia, as the LA Times explained in 2016. One of the star witnesses of the North Korean Shin Dong-hyuk later admitted to lying about his testimony. The article goes on to detail numerous cases of bogus claims of torture, fabrications, wild claims by the US government-funded World Uyghur Congress and Uyghur Human Rights Project, both funded by the government's National Endowment for Democracy. The production of stories of incubator babies and weapons of mass destruction has been industrialized and replicated on a global scale. And the latest product off the regime change assembly line is the Uyghur Tribunal.
This pertains to land back, believe it or not, in that I wrote in my article after quoting Lenin that for Marxist-Leninists to support land back, we also need to add the caveat in our analysis, in our agenda, that we need to support the self-determination of these nations in a democratic sense. We need to do what the proletarians of these colonized nations want, not kowtow to every demand for self-determination that the bourgeois, fascist, imperialist, reactionary forces throw at us. When it comes to Xinjiang, to Tibet, to I think it's Inner Mongolia, to Taiwan, there are demands for self-determination. They're made every day by reactionaries the world over. But does the Communist Party of China heed these calls for self-determination? No, they do not. They do not take seriously these demands for counter-revolution, for the destruction of the gains that the proletariat in all of these nations have acquired due to their existing under the sovereignty of the Communist Party. Because, well, not just because of common sense, but because the leaders of China have read Lenin.
Exactly. Last on the list tonight, capitalism has no endgame besides collapse and feudalistic warfare.
I've concluded that in the future that late stage capitalism is creating, the people who are most likely to be able to retain and take power are people like Eric Prince, billionaires who've already established private armies. There are these billionaires like Bezos who've been buying up huge amounts of land within the American heartland. They've also been establishing fortified doomsday compounds in places like New Zealand, which is apparently a prime target for super rich doomsday preppers. And there's so many wild science fiction possibilities that spring to mind when you think of the prospect of the super rich trying to retain power in a near future where civilization is collapsing due to capitalism's deficiencies, due to world conflicts, due to environmental collapse. We might see billionaires wielding robot armies. The US military already uses robot armies, though it doesn't like to talk about that. The US military already uses drones, and all of these weapons are manufactured by private corporations. These corporations are going to be in a position to carry out feudalistic power grabs, implement a kind of techno-feudalism, unless the masses rise up and build socialist worker states.
That last point is oh so crucial. None of this dystopian horror story has to happen. None of it is inevitable. It's the trend we're on right now. It's the direction we're headed, but it doesn't have to be the direction we end up in. It all depends on us. It all depends on proletarian solidarity, on working class solidarity, working class and all of our allies getting together and putting a stop to this madness. So, good points there. That's it for us tonight. Unless you have anything else to add? No. Okay. Then that's it. And we'll be back next week. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.